Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Russell Matthews here, back with another CRB Extension update for you. If you're new to the series, this is where we talk about any and all new information that relates to whether or not the CRB will be extended or if it will be ending. For many people who have been applying since the beginning of this benefit, their last opportunity to apply will be at the end of March, as they've filled all of their 13 possible application periods. And today we're covering some new statements from Justin Trudeau himself. He was asked a number of questions in the House of Commons yesterday, and I thought I should bring that information to you. Now, he was pretty heavily critiqued in Question Period, which is a segment of the House of Commons that goes for about an hour every single day. Usually they're not talking about benefit-related concerns, but this time they did. So let's take a look at exactly what questions were asked of him and exactly what his response was and what it could mean for you going forward. But before we do, if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you can keep being updated on exactly this issue. The first person to critique the Prime Minister's response in this session is someone named Pierre Poilievre. This is him in this shot right here. If you don't know about him, he's arguably the biggest thorn in the side of Justin Trudeau, and he's sort of always has these inflammatory statements and these things that are meant to sort of convince Canadians that Justin Trudeau is not doing a good job. The question he asks here first is more about the job losses that we've seen here in Canada, but the way Justin Trudeau responds has significant impacts on the future of benefits. So make sure to listen through the question and we'll hear what Justin Trudeau has to say about it.
834,100. That's the number of paychecks that are missing in Canada. It's the number of families sitting teary-eyed around the kitchen table trying to figure out how they're going to fund their future. And while the Deputy Prime Minister has congratulated Conservatives for supporting income programs for those same families, those families need jobs back in order to secure their future. With unemployment a third higher than the G7 average, when will those families have their paychecks back?
The Right Honourable
All right, let's hear Trudeau's response on
Mr.
this.
Speaker, from the beginning of this pandemic, we made a simple and straightforward promise to Canadians that we would have their backs, regardless of how long it took, regardless of what it took.
That's a key thing to note there. That seems to be the Liberal government's main talking point, right? He's said it, Chrystia Freeland said it. He constantly is saying we are going to continue to have Canadians' backs. Now, what you make of that can be debated. They haven't announced any sort of extension yet, but it could make you believe that they're leaning towards doing so if they can't lift these pandemic restrictions.
And that's why we delivered the CERB to 8 million Canadians, even while Conservative politicians like the member from Carleton were saying we were doing too much too fast and, oh, you shouldn't be helping workers. You got to help businesses faster than workers. Sorry. We were there for Canadians. We continue to be there for Canadians. And we know the best way to get the economy to come roaring back is to create opportunities for Canadians.
Okay, so a multi-pronged response here. He starts out by saying, yes, we're going to continue to have Canadians' backs. And then at the end of his response, he starts to sort of emphasize, we know that we need to create more opportunities for Canadians. So he's sort of mixing in these two sides, like we need jobs for Canadians, but we also need to support them till the end of the pandemic. And you can already tell that Justin Trudeau isn't the biggest fan of Poilievre, and you can see why. Take a look at this. He's actually extremely active on YouTube here, and the main content of most of his videos are critiques of Trudeau. You can see here on this headline, Hire Canadians, Fire Trudeau, the Trudeau economy. All of these sort of negative critiques of the Prime Minister's response to this rollout, as well as his handling of the economy. Now, many people are quite fond of the way he's able to critique the Prime Minister and be such a nuisance for him, because people think that this is a way that we can sort of keep our politicians honest, right? We keep on criticizing them and sort of critiquing their policies over time. But it seems that Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the Conservative Party, might not be Poilievre's biggest fan, because just last week they moved him out of his previous position that he had held for a long time as finance critic for the Conservative Party.
What the Prime Minister has just said is false. In fact, his Deputy Prime Minister thanked the Conservatives for supporting that assistance. But it just shows how out of touch he is, that he thinks that families can go on living forever off a measly $2,000 check from the government. They don't have multi-million-dollar trust funds like he does. They want jobs, like workers in other countries where unemployment is significantly lower than it is here. So why is it, Mr. Speaker, that workers abroad get paychecks while ours here at home just get credit card debts?
Okay, interesting question. So there are a couple interesting things to note here. First off is the language that he uses here, calling these $2,000 checks measly. Some may argue that using this sort of language minimizes how impactful and helpful these benefits have been for people since the beginning of the pandemic. But on the other hand, others may argue that he's using this sort of language to sort of emphasize that Canadians don't want to be on benefits long term. Rather, they are looking for jobs and want new jobs to be created so they can go back to work and hopefully earn more than $2,000. But all in all, $2,000 a month is a significant amount of money for many Canadians, so he could potentially be seen as a little bit out of touch on this by some people. Then he says something that he has been saying for quite a while every single time he gets an opportunity to talk in the House of Commons. The question is, why do people abroad get paychecks while Canadians here get credit card debt? We want jobs. So that's really the point that he's been trying to drive home over the past number of weeks. People in other countries where unemployment is lower, they're back to work and they're working at their jobs. And how come that's not happening in Canada? In Pierre Poilievre's mind, that's largely due to Justin Trudeau. Let's see how the Prime Minister responds to this.
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, among others, the IMF has recognized that Canada's approach to supporting workers, to supporting businesses, to supporting communities through this pandemic has left us better positioned to come roaring back once this pandemic is over.
That's interesting that he brings up the IMF. Just yesterday in the similar update video to this one, we talked about that new IMF report that just came out. Now, this is evidence that he could be looking heavily at that as he goes forward to make this decision about benefits. Interesting.
We had to do the things that were necessary to protect Canadians during this pandemic, and as a government, we were there to support those families. We know we are all looking forward to getting back to work right across the country, but the fact is we need to continue to be there to support them while we get through this pandemic, and this government will continue to do so regardless of what the Conservatives say.
Wow, getting pretty adversarial there. So it seems that Trudeau's taking this position of, again, we're going to be there until the end of this for Canadians, but he doesn't minimize the importance of getting back to work. He sort of is emphasizing here that we're all looking forward to getting back to work. That's what everyone does want to have happen. Now, there are a lot of people who are pushing for UBI, Universal Basic Income, and how these benefits could be transitioned into that. It seems that the Liberal government isn't in support of that right now, rather thinking that these should be very time-limited benefits, but they should be continued at the very least until the end of the pandemic, or at least that's what this government seems like they're trying to say here with this consistent talking point of we're going to have your back.
What the IMF actually did is cut Canada's growth projection for this year by a third, not to mention that we're falling behind the rest of the world on jobs. In fact, the G7 average is 6%, the US 6.3%, the EU 7.5%, Canada 9.4%. They all have COVID too, but they're getting their jobs back. Isn't it clear that for Canadians to regain their jobs, this Prime Minister will have to lose his?
Wow, those are fighting words.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this crisis demanded targeted, time-limited support to keep people and businesses afloat, and that's exactly what this government chose to do. The IMF report indeed found that Canada's strong and decisive actions at the onset of the pandemic, quote, provided crucial support to the economy and the functioning of financial markets and helped protect lives and livelihoods, and that Canada's strong history of prudent policy-making afforded it the policy space to respond forcefully to the crisis and avert much steeper declines in economic activity and employment. We were there for Canadians. We will continue to support them through this pandemic.
Same talking point. Wow. Okay. Wow, so it seems like we really have an answer here as to which report the Canadian government is going to look to. Yesterday's video, we touched really heavily on two different reports that came out right around the same time. One was critiquing Canada's rollout of these benefits and the way that they've handled the pandemic, saying we should be more focused on jobs in the future, whereas the other one is really praising the Canadian government and saying, hey, you did a good job and it was important to bring these benefits forward. It seems like that government, or the current government, is really focusing on the IMF report. report. Again, if you didn't check out that video, we did a deep dive on what's actually in these reports and how the government could be using them to determine their decision making going forward. I'll link that video down in the description. And surprisingly, there was another MP who was questioning Trudeau about benefit-related topics. Now, I've been watching these House of Commons, these question period videos for the past couple of months, so I can sift through them and find the information that's most important to you, so you don't have to watch an hour every day of this. And usually they really don't talk about benefits, and they haven't talked about it historically. But now there seems to be such an emphasis on this. It could lead us to believe that they're thinking about it more in the House of Commons and in the government, especially leading up to this March 29th date, or at least the end of March, when people will likely be putting in their last applications given the current CRB program.
Just before the holiday season, the Liberals sent out over 440,000 letters to CERB recipients, warning them they may have to repay up to $14,000. This bad news came following the worst economic downturn in nearly a century, so talk about kicking someone when they're down, Mr. Speaker. For months, Conservatives were raising the alarm on poor CERB eligibility communications, but the Liberals ignored the concerns of our constituents and instead told Canadians the upcoming tax season would be tough. Yeah, well, no kidding.
That's from
How
Carla
many
Qualtrough.
self-employed Canadians are going bankrupt by this government's failure to face up to the problems with CERB repayments?
Okay, that's interesting that they're asking this question now. Like I said, I've been watching these videos for quite a while, and they're talking about this now, which is a little bit confusing, especially given the big news from about a week ago when the government announced that for many people who were part of this whole problem with the CERB repayment issue, that they wouldn't have to pay back this money because it was due to a government error. So it's interesting that she's bringing this up now after the government has sort of provided a response already to these concerns. But she does raise some very valid criticisms of the CRA and their ability to get information out in a timely and accurate manner. Let's see what he has to say in response to that.
See, here's the situation the Conservatives find themselves in, Mr. Speaker. They, at the same time as they say, oh no, the Liberals have invested too much in Canadians. They've been too much there to support workers, too much there to support seniors, to support youth.
He's off his notes now. He's getting
far
passionate.
too much in terms of spending on Canadians to get them through this pandemic. But at the same time, they say, oh, you should have done more. You should have done more. You should have done more. They're completely incoherent, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we were guided by a very straightforward principle. Support Canadians as long as possible, as much as necessary, and that's exactly what we've been doing.
Wow, so he's really digging his heels in here, really creating some sort of opposition against the Conservative Party, saying, hey, this is what we've done. We're going to support Canadians. We have supported Canadians, and sort of calling out the Conservatives' critiques of this. But with that being said, the Conservatives did vote through the measures that allowed the CRB to happen. So they were in support of the CRB and benefits in general, and they could very well be in support of the extension of these benefits. But it's interesting to read deeper into the responses from Trudeau on these questions that are being asked of him, so we can get a better idea on what's going to happen in the future.
Mr. Speaker, the fact remains the Prime Minister is leaving thousands and thousands of Canadians behind. For example, those who aren't eligible for EI are being directed to apply for the new CERB, CRB. However, technical issues at the Canada Revenue Agency are automatically rejecting their applications. A Winnipeg couple with a newborn baby is dealing with this disaster. We've heard of the same from a single mother in Vaughan, Ontario. A year into this pandemic, Canadians are being made more and more aware of this Prime Minister's incompetence. Can the Prime Minister provide a date as to when the EI CRB issue will be resolved?
I don't really know what issue she's talking about here, and I've been covering this pretty closely. So she's talking about EI recipients transferring over to the CRB. Maybe the issue she's referring to is the fact that when you're coming from your EI, you need to wait a little bit for the CRA to get the information from Service Canada telling them, hey, this person's now off EI, and they can effectively transfer to the CRB. That must be what she's talking about.
Mr. Speaker, from the very beginning of this pandemic, we faced unprecedented hardship and situations across the country, and this government stepped up with CERB supports for over 8 million Canadians, with wage subsidies that made a huge difference in businesses across the country, with direct support for small businesses, with investments in shelters and homeless support programs, with investments to fight gender-based violence, which is on the rise in this pandemic. We have been there to support students, to support seniors. We will continue to be there to support people. And yes, as the member points out, there's more to do, and we'll do that too.
There's more to do, and we'll do that too. Is that in reference to the EI-CRB transition problem, or is he sort of hinting at their future decisions? Now, I think the most interesting thing to take away from this whole video is the way we're seeing Trudeau really dig in his heels in response to the criticisms from the opposition party, the Conservatives. Now, they're not talking specifically about the CRB and this sort of artificial end date after the 13 periods, which is going to be the end of March. They're not talking about that in the House of Commons as of yet, but it's important to take a look at what their language they're using here, because that's really going to determine what they do going forward. By seeing the Liberal government here dig in their heels and supporting the programs that they've brought forward, it makes it more likely that they're going to continue these benefits if people are in the same sort of hardships that they were when these initial benefits were created in the first place. Like, I mean, you just watched it too. You see this sort of language that the Prime Minister is using. Now imagine if he weren't to extend benefits come the end of March, right? The Conservatives would probably turn back on that and use his words against him. So the words he's using now have impact on what he has the flexibility to do later. But I'm just so surprised that there's so much benefit talk going on in the House of Commons right now. For months there was very little, and now it seems to be all over the place. So I thought I'd bring it to you to let you know that this is going on. And let me know what you think about it individually. Do you more agree with the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre that we need to be emphasizing jobs and job creation and perhaps ramping up testing and high-speed testing in order to open up areas of the economy so we can get back to work? Or are you sort of leaning on the side that we need to keep these benefits open until we can safely open up the economy and not worry about investing so much into the rapid testing sort of side of things? Either way, let me know whatever you think down in the comments. And if you can think of anyone who'd be interested in this topic and it could be helpful to them, feel free to send this video their way. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can stay up to date on this and support Canadian content right here on YouTube, which, let's face it, there's not enough of. And with all that said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video has helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.